Hi guys, welcome back. Welcome to part 2 of the multi-way series. So for today's scenario, I will be talking about a board that will contain two Broadway cards with one low card with a flush draw involved. So the scenario is similar to the previous scenario where we are sitting in the middle position, the button and the big blind are involved, and we raise and we get calls from both of them. So the flop, as I mentioned, is two high, one low, which will be queen spade, jack spade, and four diamonds for the simulation that I've run for this video. And from the simulation, we know that big blind checks to us again, which is the GTO strategy. So to help you guys visualize the scenario, I've put it in Poker Snowy. So as I said just now, early position raises, and the cutoff folds, the button calls, small blind folds, and the big blind calls, and this is the flop that we will be talking about for today. So for today, I'll be talking about GTO versus population button flattening range. The second thing I want to talk about is the ranges that we will be betting the flop with. The third will be how to play our flush draws, and the fourth is what do we do when we face a check raise, or if we plan to do some check raising ourselves against the button if he decides to bet after we check to him. Okay, so when most players are on the button, their flatting ranges are very unbalanced, and in fact, I think no limit Holdem has evolved to a point where calling on the button against an early position cutoff or under the gun open is no longer standard, and three betting is more standard instead. But in today's games, we still see calls on the button a lot in low stakes, so I will take the chance to address this. And if we look at GTO's calling range, it's about 2.8%, so it's a very tight range, versus 7.2%, which is what I think the population is calling pre-flop when it comes to, let's say, 100 NL or lower. And the GTO range has more broadways, things like ace 10 suited, queen jack suited. Not to say the population ranges doesn't have them, just that GTO has a higher weightage towards these hands. And the population range has more suited connectors that dilute so-called the strength of its range, like with hands like 7-6 suited, 8-7 suited, 9-8 suited. So these are basically the ranges. You can see how GTO plays way tighter compared to the button range, population range that I've actually assigned. And I think the reason for the range difference is that GTO basically tries to balance the weightage of hands. So you can see here, um, it has some strong suited broadways over here, but it doesn't include all combinations of like 10-9 suited, 9-8 suited, and 7-8 suited, because including all combinations would dilute the strength of your whole entire range. But when it comes to the population, you can see how there are a lot of hands here, and it's really hard for this part, this lower part, to balance the upper part. And so after running two separate simulations for this board, we can see that actually buttons range performs way better than buttons GTO range performs way better than buttons population range, three times in terms of big blind. And as I mentioned previously, this is because of how GTO basically balances the weightage of hands. Basically, when standard the standard route that players take would just be to play most combinations of 7-6 suited and Jack 10 suited by flatting, but GTO randomizes 7-6 suited 10% of the time calling and 90% folding, while playing more hands of Jack 10 suited instead. Okay, so when it comes to betting the flop, we still want to bet small. The sizes that I've used for my simulations are 40%, 75%. So GTO doesn't bet 75% pot at all, and this is because we basically have a range advantage when we are early position, and betting small allows us to include more bluffs, and this is the same for MP and button. Um, that coupled with the fact that when we bet big, we tend to tighten our opponent's range and only face basically stronger hands unless we have the nuts. And it's hard to get value from most parts of his range when we have a range advantage. So I basically talked about this in the previous video, so I shall not dive into it that much. But basically, betting small 40% versus 75% is better. Obviously, there are other options like 33%, 30%, or even 25% as well. Um, but for this simulation, I basically picked the two sizes that I frequently use. So this But for this simulation, I chose these two sizes because these two sizes are the sizes that I typically use when I play No Limit Hold'em myself. So now I'll be talking about the difference on the flop between both the ranges. Basically, the flop hits the GTO range harder because of how GTO's range has more broadways, and because of that, we can actually bet a wider range against the button because of how we have a larger range advantage. You can see here how basically the button has more suited broadways that can defend himself with like queen jack, queen 10 that gives him top pair, and like jack 10 that gives him second pair, compared to how he will basically have air if he plays the button population range that I've assigned over here, when he has this part of his range and can only defend himself if he hits this part of his range, which is like 20% of his overall range. Okay, so here are some important numbers when we consider betting the flop against a button population range. So against that range, we should be betting 53% of the time. And most of our overpairs, including aces and kings, will be bets at 83%. Our sets will be bet at 66%. Well, for our sets, I think jacks are more of a bet because of how we don't block top pair, because holding queens will block top pair. And if we hold top pair, we should be looking to bet 67% of the time. So looking at these numbers and comparing them to GTO button range, you can see how we should be betting less against a opponent that is more GTO aware of playing good pre-flop ranges. We are basically betting 10% less against a GTO button player. You can see the numbers here for yourself. The second thing I want to talk about is what to do when we are holding second pair. So basically holding Jack X. I think it's a tricky spot because our hand has some value, but at the same time, most players are not comfortable putting a lot of money in with second pair. But overall, I can tell you that Jack X should be betting 40% of the time. And how we differentiate what Jack X bets and checks based on our blockers. So we should be betting the ones with good blockers like Ace Jack or 10 Jack at a higher frequency. This is because holding the Ace or the 10 blocks him having Queen, Ace Queen, and Queen 10. And we should be never looking to check raise with these Jack X hands. Basically, because when we do check raise and face a shove or a re-raise, these hands cannot just put we cannot commit our stacks with Jack X, but we can look to keep the pot small and continue um, basically playing. And we should bet with better runouts as well. So if we have Jack X with diamonds, we can make a backdoor flush. So these hands are more valuable as bets, and we can look to actually call a check raise even if our opponent decides to check raise us. Most of the time, players get really excited when they flop a flush draw, and they tend to start out by betting, but they do not consider how checking is really important to protect our range when the next spade rolls off on the turn or on the river. So I'm going to be talking a bit about how to play flush draws versus a population button range. So our flush draws should actually be a bet 71% of the time, and the ones that are better as bets are hands like 8 9 suited, Ace 4 suited, Ace 10 suited with the spades. So these hands have really good equity. So 8 9 suited has a 10 as a straight out. Ace 4 suited already has a pair because of 4x. And Ace 10 suited basically can make a straight flush with the king, king spades, or can just make a straight with the king. And The ones that we will be looking to check call will be the low equity ones like 7-8 suited, 7-8 of spades, because it has basically no backup other than the flush draw. Even turning a pair of sevens or eights won't really be as helpful, and hence like ace deuce suited, which is basically a low ace x flush that can't make a really valuable pair other than an ace, but there is a chance that we might be dominated by a stronger ace if our opponent decides to bet and we check call with an ace x. So the last part about check raising is actually really simple. So the flush draws that we actually want to look to check raise are the really strong ones with really good backup. So like king spade, ten spades. So on queen jack of spades, it has a straight flush draw. 10-9 of spades has the same value, and ace spade, 10 spade has the same value as well. But you can see how ace spade, 10 spade should be a mix between um, betting and checking as well, and check raising as well. So this can be said for basically most of the hands that are check raising. So they are really strong, and we should be looking to kind of mix our play between betting them and check raising them at the same time. So when it comes to executing this strategy, I think we can simplify this strategy further without losing much EV, although GTO advocates a really funky way of playing flush draws. So basically the rule of thumb that I will give you guys is to bet an ace high flush draw about 75% of the time, to check call a weak flush draw, but at 100 BBs, I think calling any reasonable bet on the turn is perfectly standard. If villain decides to 2x pot, then obviously hands like 5 spades, 6 spades would be a fold on that kind of board. And we should be looking to check raise 50% of the time and bet 50% of the time with the really strong ones that I've mentioned just now, like the king spade, 10 spade, and 9 spade, 10 spades. So if you follow these rules, I think playing flush draws on basically any board would be easier for you guys to execute. Okay, so for the final part, I'll be talking about what to do when we face a check raise from the button. And we should be looking to fold 50% of our betting range and call 50% of them. And there are some hands that GTO solvers would think are better off as re-raises, but I think we can simplify our strategy, and the reason for this is actually really simple. It's because it's really hard to balance our whole range when we have three actions instead of two. And most players would basically put a lot of strong hands into their re-raises, but not they don't really mix in bluffs. So instead of complicating our strategy, I think following this basic rule would be simpler. So if we think about hands that we want to fold, um, Jack diamonds, 9 diamonds, and Jack diamond, 10 diamonds are kind of the hands that we want to fold because we are blocking bluffing ranges like 9-10 of diamonds, um, 9-8 diamonds, and 8-10 of diamonds. And we have only second pair, so we don't block top pair, which is kind of dicey. And we don't always continue with all our queen X, even though it has top pair. So the worst ones we can actually think about folding is something like a unsuited queen 10x, that a queen 10, unsuited queen 10 that we decide to open in early position, and it's one of our weaker queen x's in our range. But in general, we should never be looking to fold flush draws, even to a check raise. Sometimes after we decide to check and the button bets, we want to mix in some check raises as well. So this occurs 6.5% of the time, and we can actually simplify this by choosing not to check raise at all. But if you do decide to check raise, be sure to include some bluffs and some value hands as well. So some general rules that I can give you would be to check raise your strong flush draws as mentioned previously. Sets like Jack Jack, because we don't block top pair, Queen X. And our top two pair, which is basically Queen Jack, should be a check raise 36% of the time. So the really strong one, like queen diamonds, jack diamonds, which can make a backdoor flush draw and is kind of blocking some of villains. Well, it's not really blocking anything, but if villain decides to check raise with a hand like 9-10 of diamonds and can back into a flush, we can just stack him on the river. And with our overpairs like aces and kings, if we do decide to check, which is somewhere between 20 to 30% of the time, we should be check raising 40% of the time after that and just check calling the remaining 60% of the time. If you enjoyed today's video, please do like and subscribe, and it would mean a lot to me if you guys could comment on whether last episode's way of going through GTO trends with Monkersolver was better than today's way of using a PowerPoint presentation. So thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you guys next time.